Great. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Worldviews. Today we have on Justin Brierley. Justin is an author, writer, speaker, and broadcaster. Justin became known for his show Premiere Unbelievable, where he created dialogues between Christians and non-Christians alike, and currently has a new book out called Why I'm Still a Christian After 2 Decades of Conversations with Skeptics and Atheists. Justin, thank you for coming on Worldviews.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Justin, can we just start off with you diving into your religious upbringing?
Well, I was raised in a Christian family here in the UK, and that's not that usual because obviously the UK is a largely post-Christian culture these days. But I was fortunate to be born into a family that were committed Christians, so I grew up going to church. But really, my faith became my own, I guess, in my teenage years, particularly through the sort of wise ministry of a youth pastor and some peers in my church group. I guess I had an experience about 15 when God became very real to me. But my kind of intellectual life had to catch up with that. So I inevitably had a lot of questions. I encountered a lot of skepticism by the time I went to university, Oxford University. And that's really when I started to discover apologetics and some of those intellectual defenses of Christian faith through people like C.S. Lewis and others. So that was kind of the journey that my own spiritual journey took in those years.
Wait a minute. What was the experience at 15 years old? Was this like a supernatural thing?
Yeah, you could say that. It was what I would say was a kind of an experience of the Holy Spirit, a real sense that God had sort of entered my life in a brand new way. And that was a kind of very much a sort of wham bam moment for me when kind of faith became alive. But as I say, you can have an experience like that, but one experience can't necessarily sustain, your Christian life going forward. But it was definitely an important moment along the journey for me.
Okay. And you had your show Premiere Unbelievable, which was essentially my dream job because you got to be around to watch debates and discussions amongst brilliant minds from atheism and theism all over the world. What made you start Premiere Unbelievable?
Well, I really wanted to create a space for having good conversations. I guess I've always been an evangelist at heart, and in one way or another, I've tried to bring my faith across to people. But I kind of had this vision. I'd started working for Crimea Christian Radio back in the early 2000s, not long after I'd got married, and and I really felt like we needed to do a better job of encouraging Christians to share their faith with people who weren't Christians, particularly friends, neighbors, colleagues. So I had this idea of why don't we kind of try to model what good conversations between Christians and non-Christians look like. And that's really where the Unbelievable radio show was born. And the question mark on the Unbelievable title was an important part of that. It was asking, is this stuff believable? And what does it take to be a Christian? So that was where things started, just me bringing people together for dialogue and debate. And then the show kind of grew over time. It became a podcast. And when that happened, a lot more people from outside of the Christian circle started listening, atheists, agnostics. And that was really fun because then I really had a sense that actually I was reaching not just Christians with these conversations, but a really diverse audience. And from there, the show just grew, to eventually becoming a video show. We did conferences, books, resources, and so on. And yeah, I just learned an awful lot in the process from both the Christian and atheist guests that I featured on the show over. Yeah, it was over 17 years in the end that I hosted the show.
Yeah, I guess how'd you go about with the first couple of guests? Because I assume you had to start out with maybe college professors. How'd that go?
Well, I was kind of very new to it all when I began. I mean, I was only in my mid-20s when I started the show. I barely knew the word apologetics, let alone any actual apologists. And so I was kind of just starting out, and this was really in the early days even of the internet. It was not a kind of time when you immediately had access to a lot of names and people and so on. So I really just started with some people I kind of had access to at the time. I mean, my very first show was just an Anglican priest that I knew and his atheist neighbor coming on to dialogue. And so it was as simple as that. But I guess I just started inevitably to bump into some of the key names in theology and apologetics in the months after that. So I eventually, was able to reach out to people like William Lane Craig, who, became a very well-known Christian philosopher and debater. Um, Theologians like Alistair McGrath, who were at Oxford University in the UK. So I began to sort of connect with some of those people as the show began to take shape. But there were an awful lot of people you would never have heard of who came on the show as well, and often did a really fantastic job. The non-Christians, again, I think it took a while for people to sort of drop their defenses a little bit. I think a lot of the time when I was inviting atheists and agnostics on the show, they were a little bit uncertain what they were being invited to, because they were like, is this a setup? Am I going to be preached to? Is this going to be a kind of, some kind of trap almost? But I think the more that we hosted these radio shows and then podcast episodes and so on, the more I think the word got out that actually, no, this is, you're safe if you go into this environment. You'll be treated fairly. They're open to debate and dialogue. And so I think the show kind of, hopefully, as the years went on, it became easier and easier to invite people on, because people had gotten to know about the show, and it became not so difficult to persuade them to get involved.
Yeah, and you've had on obviously Jordan Peterson, William Lane Craig, Bart Ehrman, N.T. Wright, a lot of brilliant, brilliant minds. I'm sure you get this question quite often. But what moments or debates or discussions really stick out in your mind when you reflect on those times?
Oh yeah, it's a bit like asking me to choose between my children, honestly, because they're all so great and they're all great in different ways. I guess some of my favourites include, there was one very memorable one in 2019, which is by no means the most popular show in the archive, but it was one of my favourites, and it was the historian Tom Holland joining me to debate atheist philosopher A.C. Grayling. It was part of a series called The Big Conversation. And for those who don't know, Tom Holland has a very interesting story himself, because he wasn't exactly coming on as the Christian guest, but he'd written this fantastic book, Dominion, which laid out as a secular historian his case for why essentially the moral instincts of the West come from Christianity. And I had just been reading A.C. Grayling's magnum opus at the time, A History of Philosophy. And the very opening chapters of that book kind of absolutely rip into Christianity and its history and so on. So I knew that if I could bring these two together, it would be an interesting conversation. And so it proved. The spark really flew in that conversation. And it's one of the more kind of exciting, sparky kinds of conversations that I've had the pleasure of being in the middle of, because these were two brilliant thinkers. And it was just such an interesting conversation, especially because Tom Holland, as I say, wasn't exactly standing in as the Christian, but nevertheless, he was very much defending the way in which Christianity has shaped the West. So that was a very memorable debate to be in the middle of. But I've also really enjoyed some of the more kind of friendly, congenial kind of conversations. Again, around the same time, I went out to California and hosted an on-stage discussion between a Christian thinker called John Lennox, who's quite well known, and Dave Rubin, who's like a YouTube talk show host, sort of secular Jewish guy. And again, it was completely different to the other show I've just described, but because it was like almost, it felt like you were eavesdropping on a really interesting personal conversation. But it almost felt like, it was quite significant for Dave Rubin that there was this kind of openness to the idea of faith. He himself was going on a journey. So those two shows kind of demonstrate how different the conversations could be. And they were both really engaging and very memorable for different reasons.
Could you pinpoint who the most intelligent person you ever had in the show was?
Wow. That's an interesting question. I mean, it depends how you measure intelligence. There's such a thing as emotional intelligence, as I'm sure you know. So I wouldn't say intelligence is all that it's about. But having said that, there are just people who just seem to have an extraordinary ability to recall things and to be able to bring things up. I mean, so on that front, William Lane Craig is a good example of someone who just, within his sphere is kind of quite mind-blowingly good at accessing information. He sort of, every time I've had him on for a discussion, he researches it meticulously. He really does his homework. So that's a good example of someone, with very high intelligence and who really brings an awful lot of understanding and so on. I mean, having said all that, I wouldn't say that Bill, William Lane Craig, is necessarily, in a sense, the best guest. He's a great guest, but because, in a sense, sometimes depending on the other who's on the other side of the conversation, you don't just want that kind of brain on her legs kind of approach. You want something that's maybe a little bit more conversational, a little bit more empathetic and relational. So there's some context where Bill is absolutely the right person, another context where maybe he's not, and you do want that emotional intelligence more at the front. So it does depend, as I say, on your definition of intelligence. But yeah, I mean, Bill Craig easily up there as hugely knowledgeable, intelligent, proficient debater. And I've just actually recorded another show with him for my new podcast, where he's kind of in debate mode with another philosopher, and it is always sort of just something extraordinary to watch when he's kind of at the peak of his powers and doing that stuff.
Are you able to share who the other philosopher is?
Well, yeah, depending on when this show airs, Devin, I don't know whether this show will have gone out or not, but we've just recorded an episode of my podcast, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and it'll air in early April. And it's William Lane Craig in conversation with Philip Goff, who's a panpsychist philosopher, but has been on an interesting journey himself from atheism to a form of theism. He's kind of said that he now believes in a sort of God of limited power and a form of Christianity. So they had a really interesting conversation, Bill really putting him through his paces philosophically and theologically. It was a very spirited debate between them. So yeah, look out for that.
Interesting. And I want to get the obvious question out of the way as well. That is, since you've had so much experience engaging with both sides, what were the biggest takeaways through those years of learning through both sides of the God debate?
Well, firstly, one of the big takeaways for me was that Christianity can absolutely stand on its own 2 feet intellectually, because really the conversations began in the heyday of what's often called New Atheism. A lot of these big atheist characters like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, kind of bringing the fight to Christians and saying, look, there's no evidence for God, religion's evil, and so on. And so being able to host really important conversations between some of those folk and Christian thinkers, I think it was really helpful to be able to show that actually, no, Christianity has this incredible intellectual core. It's got this historical, philosophical, theological depth. And so learning all of that, as the moderator, was hugely helpful to me in my own journey, in my own ability to have conversations myself. And I think for a lot of people watching and listening, I think it really helped their confidence, in hosting these conversations. But something I also learned, as well as sort of that there's a really strong intellectual side to Christianity, is also that the way you have those conversations is incredibly important. As I said earlier, it's not just about intelligence, it's about the emotional side of it. And very rarely have I ever seen anyone come to faith purely on the basis of intellectual arguments. And I suppose, again, going back to one of the names I mentioned earlier, John Lennox, who's emeritus professor of mathematics and philosophy of science at the University of Oxford, he's a great example of someone who is academically brilliant, but he's also very personable, winsome. The way he engages guests when he came on the conversations for the show was always, I thought, a brilliant model of how to be a Christian apologist, because he really took people seriously. He was there to hear from them and dialogue, and that's why that conversation between him and Dave Rubin went so well. So I think that is another big takeaway, and it's all there in 1 Peter 3:15. Always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you about the reason for the hope that you have. Well, that's what we were trying to do at an intellectual level with the show. But then that important, end part of the verse, but do this with gentleness and respect, because the way you say things matter just as much as what you say. So that was an important lesson for me in the way I wanted to conduct the conversations really for the rest of my life. I wanted to create this space that was respectful, that hopefully allowed friendships to develop as well as, debates to be had. And so that was a hugely important takeaway for me.
Yeah, because it's kind of like you're doing the modern day version of what's it in the Bible, Areopagus, where they would have philosophical debates and discussions. It's kind of like looking back and 100 years from now, they look back at Premier Unbelievable and look at the same things going on and see how the modern times are being discussed and debated when it comes to God. But for you, what do you think is one, the hardest question for Christianity? And two, what's the hardest question for atheism?
Oh, well, the hardest question I think that Christians face is usually something about the problem of evil and suffering. And so I do devote a whole chapter to that particular objection in the new book, Why I'm Still a Christian, because it's the oldest question. I mean, in the book, the oldest book arguably in the Bible is the book of Job, and it's all centered around this question of suffering and evil. And so it's going to come up in some form or another, either at an intellectual level or at an emotional level. I think it's really important for Christians to be aware of how we might want to respond to that. I think there are answers to that huge question of why a good God would allow a world of evil and suffering. But at the same time, again, it's one of those ones where to simply give an intellectual answer isn't always the right answer, depending on where someone is. And often people who are in the midst of pain and suffering are looking for more of an emotional response, a spiritual response, than just a purely kind of logical or apologetic response. So I think it's that one is huge. I won't go into the answers I give in the book at this point, but I would say that's a key one. What's the biggest problem for atheism? Yeah, it's interesting because I think, as I've looked at both Christianity and atheism, I had such a, 20 years plus of opportunity to kind of compare and contrast them. The interesting thing is that I think there are actually, if you just look at it in terms of the numbers of arguments, there are lots more arguments for God than against God. As I say, the main argument against God is the problem of suffering, I would say. Whereas there are lots more, I would say, questions, for me at least, that come up for atheism. There are so many things that's hard to explain if a purely atheist naturalist account of reality is true. I mean, probably the key one for me is how do we make sense of morality? If we are, in the end, if all that exists is matter in motion, the laws of the universe, all of our moral beliefs, all of the things we value are ultimately just kind of illusions, really, that have been foisted upon us by a sort of purposeless process. And the problem is that none of us actually live life like that. None of us think about morality in that way. None of us actually engage life that way. So I think that is a serious problem for atheists, because it's very hard to reconcile the atheist worldview with the fact that we do seem to live in a moral universe, where these things are absolutely the most foundational important things we can think of. And it's why I think, for many people, whether they've called it this or not, the moral argument for God has been one of the most persuasive arguments. It was for C.S. Lewis. His journey from atheism to theism, the moral argument for God was really what took him across the line. It was another further journey to kind of embrace full-blooded Christianity. But I've met a lot of people for whom just recognizing that there is such a thing as evil has been kind of the first serious move towards God, because it's often when you're confronted by real evil that you realize, no, this isn't just atoms and electrons or socio-cultural forces. There's something real here and it needs explaining. So that for me, if you had to ask me for one of the things that I think is the hardest for atheism to account for, it would be morality.
Yeah, and I was looking to see also if you could, because in modern society, at least in America, the two things you never talk about are religion and politics, and that's kind of conditioned into the American mind. But you brought up on Sean McDowell's show that there's certainly a rise in openness to hearing conversations around Christianity and God. I think you even cited some kind of statistic that showed that the amount of people, more than you would think at least, would go to church if you simply just asked them to go that aren't usual church goers. Could you just speak on your discoveries with the change in openness in people today?
Mm. Well, this very much is part of the theme of the last book I published, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and there's an accompanying podcast documentary series around it. But yeah, really, in a nutshell, I have been seeing in my time hosting these conversations between Christians and atheists a real sea change in the kind of openness to God, both at an intellectual level. I think you're seeing, the new atheism, I think, waned. It's no longer what it was. And today you see all kinds of interesting secular intellectuals taking God very seriously again. People like Jordan Peterson, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the historian I mentioned earlier, Tom Holland. And but that's not the only way in which I think we're seeing a kind of a real change and an openness to God. I'm sensing that there's a lot more openness among the general public, especially here in the UK, where I live. As I say, a very post-Christian secular culture, and one where for a long time people have just assumed church going is, on the way out. Christianity will one day die out, and so on. I don't think that's true, and I think there's all kinds of interesting signs that, especially the youngest generation, are waking up to the need for God. So some of the statistics that I was sharing with Sean include the fact that Gen Z young men in the US, for instance, have overtaken women for the very first time in church going. And I'm seeing a huge rise in interest among young men in church, in places like the Eastern Orthodox Church. They've seen a huge boom in young men coming in. And it's interesting. A lot of them are looking to these more traditional, ancient forms of church. And I think it's because there's a kind of meaning crisis in our culture, especially if you're a young man. I think there's a kind of identity crisis that's fueling this. And people are kind of ready to hear the Christian story again. So again, coming back to the UK, I was speaking with someone who works for a student ministry that runs campus ministries across the country. And he was just telling me that sort of at an anecdotal level, they've been seeing far more openness to the gospel, all kinds of stories of students converting to Christianity than they've seen in years. And so they did some research to see if something had changed. And to their shock, when they did this research across thousands of non-Christian students, they found that 75% said that if they were invited to church, they would say yes, which they've never seen any kind of openness like that before. But it's being reflected in all kinds of other statistics. Just very recently, research here in the UK, again, among Gen Z, the youngest generation, the most unchurched generation, but the most open generation, it turns out, to spirituality. Again, half as likely to be atheists now as their parents or grandparents. And again, I'm hearing so many stories from church leaders around the country about a kind of new willingness of young people walking into church. I know a church leader in Oxford who says they're seeing unprecedented numbers of young people coming in, giving their life to Christ. I'm hearing similar stories from various churches in London. So, some research that's going to be published at Easter here in the UK showing an extraordinary rise again in this demographic of young men, especially going to church. So predictions of the church's death and Christianity's death have been, very much overstated in the West. I think something is happening, and I'm quite excited to see where it may lead. It's a little bit of a different picture in the USA because there's still far more of a kind of cultural Christianity that pervades certain parts of the US. And what I'm hearing, especially among Gen Z in this country, is that the kind of things have flipped to the point where now, because there's such a kind of unchurched kind of atmosphere among young people, they've had almost no encounters with church. It's now become boring to be an atheist. It's like there's nothing different about that. It's much more edgy and rebellious to become religious, to become a Christian. And so that's the kind of new thing, if you will. It's kind of become cool, basically. And I'm not quite sure it's at that point in the US because there is still a large kind of Christian majority/minority now, but it's still kind of present in a way that isn't. And so anyway, those are just some of the interesting dynamics going on at the moment, sociologically. But over it all, what I would say is happening is basically people need a story to make sense of their life. And as we run out of steam in the West with the stories we've been telling ourselves, I think people are ready to hear the Christian story again. And so for me, I've called it this surprising rebirth of belief in God.
Yeah, after finding out all that information, has that motivated you more to engage the stranger on the street?
Honestly, yes, it has. And that's partly because I think the stranger on the street is more open to talking about God than they used to be. this change in the atmosphere, I think, has made it easier for Christians to have conversations. I'm hearing that again. Lots of people talking about the fact they're just having conversations that they didn't really get the opportunity to have 10, 15 years ago, when this very skeptical new atheism was kind of the way people were often thinking about religion. I've had some fantastic chats with my Muslim barber just recently, and really interesting kind of conversations with him about faith and belief. I'm talking to young people a lot more about faith and belief. I'm seeing in my teenage son and daughter's kind of life a kind of an openness among their peer group, and a willingness to talk about God that I don't think ever existed when I was their age among kind of secular friends. So yeah, I do. I think it's made me more confident. I think it's making other people more confident, because it feels like people are kind of ready to hear you again.
That also made me think when you mentioned your Muslim barber. Did you ever have Muslims on Premier Unbelievable?
Yeah, yeah, and it would be a mistake to say it was just Christians and atheists. Yeah, we had lots of debates between people of other worldviews, lots of debates between Muslims and Christians, but we also did, Judaism and Christianity, Buddhism, other forms of religion over the years. Some of the Islamic debates were actually probably the sparkiest ones, because those were the ones that were most likely to kind of maybe get quite heated sometimes. That was partly because of the characters I sometimes invited on. If you've ever seen Muslims engaging in dawah, in Islamic evangelism on street corners, or there's a special place in London called Speaker's Corner at Hyde Park, and I even filmed an audio documentary of the debates that go on there historically between Christians and Muslims, and they can get very heated and very loud. A lot of kind of rhetoric. So those were quite different sometimes, the kinds of conversations I would host on those issues. But yeah, again, very interesting. Learned a lot along the way. Made some friends as well, And so yeah, and obviously, arguably, I would say now Islam is a much more potent threat. Might be the wrong word, but a kind of force in the UK compared to atheism. Atheism, I think, has kind of shriveled up to a large degree in the UK. And if there's alternative worldviews vying for people's imagination, Islam is definitely one of them.
Interesting. It's interesting too, seeing there's certainly a rise, at least on YouTube, of anti-Islam apologetics. I would say that's something I've definitely noticed, and also because it seems like Islam's currently the fastest growing religion, at least by birth. So they're getting a lot of people there, but it seems like there's more people leaving as well, since there's more information about what the actual Islamic traditions and religion actually states.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And I think it's a two-way street. It has been in terms of Christianity as well, of course. But yeah, Islam absolutely, in terms of birth rates, Islamic majority countries are way ahead of most Christianized Western countries. But as you say, yeah, I have met a lot of ex-Muslims in my time. A lot, and there's a really interesting sort of stuff happening in different parts of the world, often very underreported, but very significant numbers of Muslims often coming to Christian faith for various reasons. That's sometimes because of a sense that Islam has failed them in terms of its record on violence and the cultures that they're seeing around them. Often it's happening in quite supernatural ways. You look at the church in Iran, for instance, that has gone from about 10,000 in the mid-90s to over 1 million today. Probably the fastest growing church in the world right now is the underground church in Iran. So you should not underestimate what is going on there. Now, it's a mixed picture, though, because obviously there are so many political issues, and, Syria and everything currently in turmoil. There's a lot of questions over what that means, and you've obviously seen lots of parts of the Middle East almost emptied out of Christians because of the persecution that exists there. So it's one of the harder things to track exactly where the trends are going. But having said all that, I think there's a significant number of Muslims today who are arguably coming to faith more than at any other time in history. So yeah, we'll see where it heads.
Yeah, a big note too is recently the biggest, I guess, he was a former Muslim, and his YouTube content's basically against Islam, against all type of Muslim content. I think his name was Apostate Prophet. He recently came
That's
to
right.
Christ the other
Mm.
day, which is quite extraordinary to
Yeah.
hear. Very
Yeah,
cool.
I've been
But
tracking his story a little bit, and he's had a lot of conversations with other Christian YouTubers and influencers like David Wood. And yeah, it felt, I think a lot of people anticipated converting to Christianity was on the cards for the last year or so. But yeah, it was really exciting to see that he has officially, I think, been accepted into the Orthodox Church, interestingly. And yeah, it's such an interesting one because that is an interesting journey to go from Islam to essentially atheism and then to Christianity. And I think the interesting thing is that whereas you were seeing a lot of people apostatizing from Islam to atheism, I think a lot of people are realizing now it's not a very satisfactory place to end up. It might be a kind of holding place for a while as you sort your beliefs out, but I don't think in the end atheism really satisfies people. I think, for those who are looking for a kind of story to make sense of their life, atheism, the problem is it's not a story, it's a non-story. And so that's why I'm seeing so many kind of people now describing themselves, interestingly, as lapsed atheists, even here in the UK, just this weekend at the time of recording. Really interesting column came out from a journalist called Giles Corran, who writes for The Times. And he's been basically a secular Jew all his life. And this column was about the fact that he started going to church a few years ago with his family, just his local Anglican parish church, at the behest actually of his teenage son, who wanted to find out more about Christianity. And he's become a Christian. And he says, I was not expecting this, but actually I was looking for something, and this was the thing. And he used this word, which I've heard a lot of people like him describing themselves as lapsed atheists. They've kind of got to the point where they've realized secular liberal humanism just doesn't really offer much. And they're kind of disillusioned with the kind of empty promises of secular culture. And I think they've realized I need a story. And actually, this Christian story, a lot of them, I think, have almost at an intellectual level been converted by people like Tom Holland, that historian I mentioned earlier. And they've realized, actually, basically, all the things I fundamentally believe came from Christianity. And so then there's this kind of, they find themselves trapped between, the sort of the secular assumptions they once held, but no longer really seem to make sense of life. But what can I jump into this kind of weird supernatural story about God and Jesus? And it's really interesting to see some of them making their way. And I think Apostate Prophet is another good example of that. He's kind of thought, actually, I think I can make sense of this, and I think I need to embrace it.
hmm I know we're pushing up on time, so I'll try to get you with two more questions before I get you out of here. But I wanted to hear your answer to this one. If you could witness any theist and non-theist have a dialogue on any topic, who would you choose and what topic? And this could be throughout history. You could pick
I was going
C.S.
to say,
Lewis versus
living or dead. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, great. I mean, obviously, if I could go right back, I'd love to see St. Paul, debating maybe one of the great minds of his time. I would have loved to just be a fly on the wall at the Areopagus, that you mentioned earlier, when he was making the case for Christianity. But I suppose, coming to more contemporary times, I would, seeing C.S. Lewis engage Richard Dawkins would be great fun. I'm not sure how far they'd get, but it would definitely be a popular episode of the show. Yeah, so that might be my one. The one I always wanted to put in conversation with someone but failed to was Christopher Hitchens, because he was actually, I think, of the four so-called horsemen of New Atheism, I think he was kind of the most fun
Yeah.
and the most interesting. And I would love to see him, if he were still with us now, sort of engaging now with his great friend Ayaan Hirsi Ali, wouldn't that be a fascinating conversation? Ayaan Hirsi Ali, having been one of the new atheists in her own time, and now is a very committed Christian. Seeing her and Christopher just having a conversation, I think would be fabulous.
Okay, last question for you. What is one question you would ask God if you knew He would answer it right now?
One question I would ask God if I knew He would answer it right now. I think I'd ask, how are you going to make everything come right? Because I guess that's the question that at the bottom of a lot of things is, what's going on, God? There's so much confusion in the world, and I have faith, obviously, in God. I have trust that it's going to come right, but sometimes you want to kind of ask how. When you see a lot of the convulsions going on politically, religiously in the world, a lot of the very negative trends in terms of what AI is doing to us, in terms of digital kind of addiction, the sad rates of anxiety and depression among young people in the world today. It all sparks me the question, well, how but we have this promise, this hope that God is going to restore, renew, redeem everything. I guess my burning question would be to God, how is it going to happen? I know it's going to happen, but how? Yeah, I think that's the one I'd ask.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, Justin, thanks for coming on, man. Any last words, wisdom for the audience?
Well, thanks for the conversation. It's been really fun. Just to say that the new book, if I are looking for that, is called Why I'm Still a Christian. If you want more from me and some of the other things we've talked about today, my podcast and my other book, justinbrierley.com is the website.
Wait, so are we never going to get like a Premiere Unbelievable sequel?
We're never going to get the what sequel?
Yeah, like are you going to do the show again?
The Unbelievable Show.
Yeah.
Well, watch this space. I'm hoping to be able to launch a new dialogue-based show before the end of this year. So you may find something coming back in due course.
Cool. That's good to know. Appreciate it, Justin.
Take care. God bless.